Now, regulation can be good, but regulation can also be bad. Good regulation protects us. It protects us from fraud. It protects us from harm. It makes society more stable. Bad regulation may also make society more stable, but it makes it stable so that you can't innovate. Bad regulations tend to stifle creativity and stifle innovation and can sometimes create costs with no benefit. Bad regulation may create costs or barriers to entry, or may even create monopolies or large, powerful oligopolies without much benefit to consumers or society of doing that. And so we have to be very careful and ask, is there too much regulation? Now, you may or may not like what happened in the U.S. in the last election with Donald Trump getting elected. You may not like parts of him. And I'm not a big fan of Trump, at least on some of his social or moral positions. But he is right about one thing, that regulations have a tendency to get created and stay forever. And so I will 100% agree with his point that we tend to get more and more and more regulations. We have a tendency to want to create regulations without removing regulations. Now, I might not like the regulations he's removing. I may not like the direction he's going, but his message that we ought to be thinking about taking away a regulation when we add a regulation is not a bad idea for a government as a concept. Is that let's look at regulations, and there may be regulations on the books that are far obsolete. And you may look and say, this, we don't need this, or this is inappropriate, or this is irrelevant. We may also have a tendency to want to stop change. Governments like stability, but stability is incompatible with innovation. And so we want to innovate, we want to change. If governments were able to stop smartphones, would that be a good thing? Well, no, of course it's not. And of course we don't want governments telling us how much computing power we can have in our pocket or what we can do with apps on our phone. No, go away, leave us alone. But sometimes government regulation is good and is helpful. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't regulate. I'm saying let's think carefully about regulations and about whether they're just a knee-jerk reaction to change or whether they are truly protecting society. Good regulation helps society and helps individuals. Bad regulation opposes change without a corresponding benefit. So we need to talk about the cost and benefits of regulations. Now, sometimes people will look and say we need weaker regulations or less regulations. And in some ways, they're not wrong. Weaker regulations does tend to lead to more profits. Because we weaken banking regulations from the time of Ronald Reagan through the time of Donald Trump, because we weakened over time, or at least through 2008, we weakened banking regulations. Bankers made more and more money. The profits were huge. But of course, then there was the 2008 financial crisis, and then we re-regulated. And we put more regulations in. It probably went too far. But those regulations were designed to help us to avoid the next financial crisis. And some people are looking and saying the current efforts in the US and in Europe and other places to deregulate may be good for profits, but may be bad for society. It may lead to a financial services meltdown. These weaker regulations resulted in 2008 in a global crisis. But it wasn't the first such global crisis. And poor regulations or weak regulations on currency trading or inappropriate regulations on fixed exchange rates and lack of regulations on lending led to a late 1990s financial crisis in Asia, the Asia economic crisis. We have the 2008 crisis. We have the S&L crisis before the 2008 crisis. We have crisis after crisis. The goal of regulations is to reduce the number of such crises. And by weakening regulations that were put in place after the Great Depression to try and say no more Great Depression, well, that was good, but bankers weren't making a lot of money. Weaker regulations means higher profit. Weaker regulations means less stability, not just for a nation, but for the planet Earth. Because an economic crisis in one country can easily spill over into other countries, as happened in 2008. And so weaker regulations worries governments, worries politicians, in part because they worry about people and they have altruistic or good hearts, some of them. In part because they worry about their jobs, because weaker regulations leading to social instability might lead people to elect a different person to run their country or to rise up in military rebellion against a dictator that they don't like, who is not protecting their personal interests. So it doesn't have to be a democracy that can change control because of a crisis. So that's it in terms of regulation. Regulation is good, but too much regulation can be bad. Too little regulation can be bad. Regulation has a role, but we need to balance its cost versus its benefits. Thank you.